This is lesson 75, and it's all about a fall in the exchange rate and will it help to improve macro performance. And the second essay is all about will a fall in the exchange rate improve macro stability. Now fundamentally, of course, all you really need to know is on this essay is on the first one, which is an AS essay, is just to say, well, if you reduce the exchange rate, 3 out of the 4 main objectives will improve. Full employment, we're going to get more jobs, the balance of payments is going to get better, we're going to get more economic growth because there's a rise in aggregate demand. However, you're going to get cost push inflation, you could also get demand pull inflation, so it achieves 3 out of the 4 objectives. What I'm now doing is I'm moving this to an A2 standard, so the essay is slightly more complicated, but I'm assuming that you already know that first part. Right, well, if we look at a floating exchange rate, one of the big things about a floating exchange rate is you can have an independent monetary policy. Now, what I would then do when we talk about that is to say, well, okay, the UK has had an independent monetary policy, and that's really useful because we've had the interest rate at 0.5% for 5 years, we've been able to reduce the exchange rate, we've been able to print money, expansionary monetary policy, and that has really probably saved the UK because we've also had a contractionary fiscal policy. Now, without an independent monetary policy, unlike the euro, where you just have one monetary policy for the whole of Europe, that has meant that the UK has been able to get out of its recession, and we've now got growth of 3%. So having your own independent monetary policy is really, really important. However, there are clearly some advantages to having a fixed exchange rate, and without making it too complicated, with a fixed exchange rate, then clearly exporters and importers will know the price that they're going to get for each of their goods. That creates more stability. If there's more stability, there's more investment, and that's obviously got to be a good thing. The other one is slightly harder to understand, but if you have a fixed exchange rate, you can't use the exchange rate to regain competitiveness. So therefore, if you have higher inflation than another country, it makes you immediately tackle that problem, because if our inflation rate is 5% and Germany's is 2%, we're going to lose competitiveness pretty quickly. So it forces producers to make sure that they're efficient, and it forces the government to tackle the problem of inflation. On exactly the same level, also if you have a trade deficit, you've got to tackle that problem pretty quickly, otherwise you're going to have to be borrowing money or attracting hot money into your country. So therefore it improves discipline in terms of the economy, and in some respects that may be quite a good thing. However, in the UK's case, because we've always had a trade deficit for the last 30 odd years, and actually part of that is a lot of that has been paid for by foreign direct investment, we need that degree of flexibility. Maybe one day we can become like the German economy, which is just really, really successful and is really efficient. It's got high levels of productivity. It's got the Mittelstand. It's got a very good industrial structure. So for them to have a fixed exchange rate is not so much of a problem. And then I would give the example of when we did have a fixed or a semi-fixed exchange rate was 1990 to 1992. And that was when we were in the RM. Now that was a complete disaster for us. And I'm just going to go over this again, although I've already been over it. Was we had a trade deficit in the UK, so therefore the supply of sterling was always greater than the demand for sterling. Therefore we had to have high interest rates to attract hot money, to therefore push our exchange rate up. So that's what we did. But not only do we have high interest rates during that period of time to attract a lot of money, we also had a high exchange rate. And the reason why we had a high exchange rate was because we decided that we wanted to be more like the German economy, and that would help to keep inflation down. But the speculators realised that eventually we were going to crash out of the fixed exchange rate, and so they just sold loads and loads of sterling. So therefore the UK had to have higher and higher interest rates to attract the hot money. And eventually the combination of high interest rates and high exchange rates led to a recession. So it was really a period, and you've heard me say it before, of some pretty bad economic decision making. And it was pretty lucky that we never joined the euro, which was the idea behind the exchange rate mechanism on there. So that's a pretty good example of why we do not want to have a semi-fixed exchange rate or even a fixed exchange rate, because our economy is not made like that anymore. Okay, so then the argument's going to be we want to have a floating exchange rate, and the big advantage of having a floating exchange rate is if you have a trade deficit, then the supply of sterling will increase, so therefore the exchange rate will fall down, so therefore export prices will fall and import prices will go up. Now, if that is the case, then obviously your trade deficit will improve, okay, but that is dependent upon the Marshall-Lerner equation, which we've already done previously, and there's going to be a J-curve effect. Did this work? Yes, it did. Between 1992 and 1996, the exchange rate when we came out of the ERM fell by 20%. We could also have low interest rates, and we got very high economic growth. It worked. There was a fear that we would get inflation, but we didn't because of the role of China producing loads and loads of cheap goods. So when we got to 2008 and we had another great big recession, in a sense we followed the same sort of policies. Interest rates went down to 0.5%, the exchange rate fell. However, so far this process has not worked, and as I've said previously, it's because our manufacturing sector was so much smaller. However, we will eventually rebalance the economy, and imagine if we hadn't had a low exchange rate, then I could say that we definitely would have been in a recession for even longer. So it hasn't worked yet, we're still waiting for that to work, but at some stage we will sell more exports. So the application of that is the application of that process. But we are actually selling more exports to the BRIC countries and to the Mint countries. So we are exporting more, so hopefully then we will eventually, via the fall in the exchange rate from there, we will eventually get export-led growth, and the export-led growth is really good because it kicks in the multiplier accelerator, that leads to a rise in AD, that rise in AD then sets off the accelerator again, leads to a rise in investment, and we want to move our economy away from consumption and government spending. So this process of having a floating exchange rate is pretty good for the UK economy. However, as you're always going to say at the end, just because you've got a floating exchange rate is not going to solve all of your problems. So this is the conclusion. Okay, it will help us, but hopefully we can always kick off our supply side economics as well. And if you have really good supply side and you have a falling exchange rate, then your exporters should do so much better, e.g. a fall in the corporation tax to 21%, pretty good supply side measure. And then if both of those work together and the supply side can control the extra inflationary pressures caused by the fall in the exchange rate, then you are going to achieve macro stability. What does macro stability mean? It means that we have good economic growth, sustainable economic growth, an economy that's not run on consumer debt, trade debt or budget debts, and then we're going to be okay. So right now I would argue that a floating exchange rate, particularly for the UK, is really, really good. I know the euro is also a floating exchange rate. However, within Europe, it is like a fixed exchange rate, and that is causing serious repercussions for the Greece and Spain economy. So particularly these days with the power of speculators, you almost have to have a floating exchange rate. Just one more final addition on there. One of the big problems today is, and why it's not working as well as we thought it might do, is because of China. China has a huge trade surplus. So therefore what should happen is, if I just take this S-curve off here, with China, their exchange rate should shoot up. Their demand for their currency will shoot up, which will therefore mean that the exchange rate will also increase. So therefore they would then rebalance their economy towards buy more imports from the UK. But we all know that the Chinese are pretty clever, and they've had a managed exchange rate, which has always meant that they have sold their currency and perhaps gone out and brought dollars to keep their exchange rate low, because they're an export driven economy and they need to sell lots of exports to keep employment high in China. However, if the Chinese did increase their exchange rate, which is what should happen under a floating exchange rate system, then the economic balances in the whole world, the trade deficits, etc., may cancel each other out. So This essay then is assess the importance of floating exchange rate. It is about, we want to have an independent monetary policy, got it. A fixed exchange rate, there are some advantages to it. However, when we did have a semi-fixed exchange rate, that was a complete and utter disaster for the UK. This is why a floating exchange rate is so good, because it's going to quickly write this down again. If there's a trade deficit, we're going to sell more, imports are going to be greater than exports, therefore the exchange rate will fall. If the exchange rate therefore falls, Marshall only kicks in, J-curve, worked in 1992, 1996, hasn't worked yet, but probably will work at some stage. That's the application of it. Hopefully the fall in the exchange rate will achieve export-led growth, which is in the government's plan for growth, and we are definitely selling more exports to Brazil, Russia, India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria and Thailand. So we sell more exports to them. Having the euro, which is like a fixed exchange rate within Europe, although the euro is a floating exchange rate, has led to complete crisis in those countries. It's a complete disaster. However, you conclude at the end of the essay, a floating exchange rate will help an economy, but you must have good supply side. In particular, the one drawback of floating exchange rate is higher inflation, and higher inflation can be controlled. Remember this, how do you control inflation? Ideally, you control it through supply side economics. You've just got 25 out of 25 on that essay, which begs the question, when it came up in the exam, is why didn't my students do that question? Perhaps I haven't taught it particularly well. I think it's a beautiful piece of economics, and it's exactly what the government is doing right now. Thank you.